Thank you, Minister. Senator Milne.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Well, I rise this evening. I've heard a lot of drivel in a decade in the Senate, and often it just is drivel to fill in time, and that's precisely what's going on here tonight. So anyone listening to this debate needs to understand that what the government has now set up as a filibuster, the fact that we had Senator Seselja vote a little while ago against an inquiry into this bill to spell out the provisions of the bill and now seeks to have the minister explain something that's already been explained. And I'll tell you why. It's because out in the back rooms the crossbenchers are out there trying to stitch up an even worse deal with the government, because the government is now with its tail up because it's got the Labor Party to cave in to 33,000 gigawatt hours. They've got them caved in on forest logging because the Labor Party did not make it a condition of accepting this deal that they get rid of the native forest logging component. And now we've got the anti-wind, anti-science, anti-the future, pro-logging group on the crossbench out there negotiating with the government to see what other disasters they can incorporate into the RET. That's exactly what's going on now. And I call it drivel for this reason. Nobody who's actually stood up and spoken on this can clearly have been out into a coup in Tasmania's native forest, because if they had, they would know that 90% of what comes off that coup has gone to the wood chippers in the past. Talk about log for a high-value purpose, not on your life. The only reason that they go ahead with the logging is because of the money they got from the wood chippers. That's what made it economically viable for guns to make a fortune over all those years and then ultimately go broke when the bottom dropped out of the native forest market. There is no market for the logging of native forests, and so this is an attempt to create a market, to make logging native forests viable. And why is that? Because when the loggers themselves recognised there was no future in native forest logging, they approached the conservation movement to try and work out how they could get out of native forests. They did then get out of native forests with a deal where the Commonwealth spent hundreds of millions of dollars paying them to get out of native forests. The exit packages for the loggers were paid to get them out of native forests, and now then in came the Prime Minister Abbott. He said he would overturn that peace agreement on the forests in Tasmania. He'd get the loggers back to work. Only he didn't know enough about it to know they were never going to get back to work because there is no market for native forest wood chips. And so now they are trying to create one. And hearing someone stand here and say this will be logged in accordance with regional forest agreements, exactly, and that is what's gone on for the last 10 years, and RFAs are exempt from the EPBC. There are no provisions to protect habitat, threatened species. We are seeing logging on Bruny Island as I stand here today, killing the habitat for the swift parrot, a threatened species. Wrote to the minister and said, "What are you doing about that? What are you doing about that?" and got a letter back from Minister Hunt saying, from the Threatened Species Commissioner, who's just been set up, saying nothing, not doing anything about it, won't be doing anything about it, not our jurisdiction. Right across Australia, regional forest agreements have overseen disastrous native forest operations, removing the habitat for our threatened and critically endangered species. And Forestry Tasmania is such a basket case. Even today in the Legislative Council you've had Sue Smith down there saying it should be sold off and disbanded. Well, that's absolutely where it's got to, because they're in debt up to their necks. They have had to transfer $30 million from the electricity networks in Tasmania to prop them up, and they've had to even get a letter of comfort from the Tasmanian government, or they'd have been trading insolvent. And now we've got a government running around trying to put some value into native forest logging by giving them credits, certificates from renewable energy, and it is not renewable energy. It can never be renewable energy to log a native forest, to put it into a forest furnace, to burn it for electricity. That is never going to work, and what is more, it is going to lead to a massive consumer campaign against any retailer that tries to sell this electricity, because it will be, as it was a decade ago when we ran the last campaign against this, and we will continue to do it. They were then known as burnt koala certificates. They will be now not only burnt koala but burnt swift parrot, burnt everything else certificates, because that's exactly what is going on here. And I hate to think what is being stitched up out the back room as we stand here and speak. No doubt it's an attempt to undermine wind, because this deal of 33,000 gigawatt-hours was actually designed to try and save wind. And these people hate wind. So they will be out there trying to stitch up some deal that even restricts wind, and you've got the Clean Energy Council having facilitated it, Labor gone down and down and down to 33,000, when Bill Shorten, the Leader of the Opposition, stood with me in Barton at a public meeting saying Labor is not for turning. This is actually the government wearing everyone down, except the Greens, I have to say, standing proudly, and Senator Lazarus stood with us on the second reading. We're the only ones in this place who stood up and said we like 41,000 gigawatt-hours. There was no rationale whatsoever for actually weaseling it down to where they have got it to, except that the government didn't like the fact that there is too much electricity in the system. They needed to take out 9,000 megawatt-hours. They could have done that by shutting down coal-fired power stations, but they didn't want to, because their objective was to prop up coal-fired power and destroy renewable energy. And if they can get destroying forests into it, that is exactly what they'll do. And, Mr Chair, while we hear the minister over there telling us about how marvellous these logging operations are and how sustainable, there's an open letter today from 40 scientists across Australia writing to the Senate. But what they obviously don't understand is that this is an anti-science government. This is an anti-science crossbench. They don't want to have the science put in their faces because they're not interested in science, and that is exactly the case. So these 40 scientists have written today saying the acceptance of a perverse definition of wood waste and renewables is being questioned by them in their joint letter. They are alarmed that once the door opens on burning Australia's native forests in power furnaces, it could see our forest heritage drawn into supplying an export demand to satisfy the expanding number of biomass burners overseas. The wood fuel market has potential to impact even more destructively on our forest ecosystems, wildlife and water catchments than has the export wood chip industry. If it can be burnt, it won't be safe, said Peter Gell, Professor of Environmental Science at Federation University. Ironbarks, bloodwoods, the box ironbark forests and woodlands, the forest types that the chip has rejected, would all be targets for the resource mix if the RET bill passes Parliament as it stands. That is from Australia's leading scientists writing to this Senate, and yet we have got a situation where people are sitting here thinking that this would be a good idea. It is hard to believe that in this country we've got to the point where we are rejecting the latest science, where we still have a situation where the logging industry is exempted from the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and where we have got this perverse idea that we will give a financial incentive to give viability to native forest logging when it clearly has no viability. They would not be harvested anyway, as Senator Birmingham tried to suggest. No, they will not, because they're in debt up to their necks. You are putting back into it a financial incentive to destroy native forests, and it is absolutely despicable. And as the scientists said, it's a falsehood to claim this type of electricity production as renewable. You can't renew or replace the burnt carbon stored in a 100 to 600-year-old forest in the turnaround time needed to address climate change, said Professor Gell. If all Australian native forest log production in 2009 had instead been burnt for electricity, it would have substituted as little as 2.8% of our coal-based power generation. So we risk unleashing an industry with a potential appetite to decimate our native forests and all the services they provide to gain very limited emission benefit. This is very poor environmental policy and poorer energy policy, and that is the fact of the matter. And when I get back to what they have said about satisfying the export demand to satisfy the expanding number of biomass burners overseas, this is a horror show. Let me tell you, these free trade agreements that the government has stitched up, and let's talk about South Korea. We've signed up one with China today. In those free trade agreements, you wait. There will be agreements to send shiploads of whole logs and shiploads of pellets to South Korea to burn in forest furnaces. and it won't be long before we're doing the same with Japan. And this is where the world is going. Tragically, there are countries like Australia prepared to raze the last of their forests and sell them to other countries to burn, not to use even in the production of paper, as what they suggested previously. The poor quality wood chips that went from here didn't even make it into the paper mix. They went straight into the furnaces to run the place, to actually generate the electricity. This is what they did in the Stone Age. This is what they did in the Stone Age, and that is where you want to take us back, and it is completely wrong. The renewable energy target should be being increased. The rest of the world recognises as we go into Paris at the end of the year that we need to get out of fossil fuel energy production as fast as possible. The energy race of this century has already been won by the renewables. The jobs, the technology, the brain space, everything depends on moving fast into the low-carbon economy, not actually frustrating it and actually locking us in to more dig it up, cut it down, ship it away and now burn it as well. This is utter, appalling policy, and it is really sickening, Minister, to hear you stand there and just regurgitate all of the lines that the loggers have used for years about sustainability and regional forest agreements and ecologically sound logging. Go out onto the coops. Go out and see the mess that they have left. Look at the stats on the number of species now on the threatened and critically endangered list. And don't stand up here and tell the Senate that logging in Australia, native forest logging in Australia, has been anything other than extremely destructive at the industrial scale that it has operated. And then go and have a look out at those forests where the Bentley blockade was, for example. And here you have more threatened species being able to be cleared even for expanded coal mines. How obscene is that? Offsets that enabled those primary forests to be cleared for coal mines. This is a disgrace. We are so much of a pariah at a global level. If you just stepped out of this country for 5 minutes and saw the conversation that's being had around the world, this is such an opportunity cost to this nation. Every other country is getting ahead of us in terms of technology, in terms of jobs. Our brain space is going to leave this country. Young people are going to take their skills overseas because they want to be part of the solution. They do not want to stay here and be locked into the problem. And so I would ask every senator, read this open letter from the 40 leading scientists. Think about biodiversity, think about the climate, think about the value of forests, and do not support this absolute backward step, because every single bit of this, you have to just look at the Prime Minister's words. He said the reason it's 33,000 gigawatt-hours is not because he wants to give certainty to the renewable energy industry. No, the reason it's 33,000 gigawatt-hours is because he couldn't get it any lower. That's as low as he could go in this Senate, but he will go lower if he can. And in terms of does it mean more wind, what did the Prime Minister say? He can't stand it. There's too many of them. He doesn't want to see any more of them. But he spoke to the loggers at their dinner and said he thinks they're marvellous. They do a great job. Yes, that's exactly where this is going. This is not about certainty. This is about the far right in Australian politics getting what they can out of the Labor Party, getting what they can out of the crossbench, dragging it lower and lower and lower. They'll put it in their back pockets and they'll go lower still. They don't compromise. They have no intention of providing certainty. And there's been a biggest con job out with the Clean Energy Council thinking this gives anyone certainty. It doesn't. The only certainty it gives them is that the Liberals will pocket this, what they can get now, and will go after the rest later. None of this is safe under this government because you don't believe in renewable energy. You do not believe in renewable energy. You don't believe in reining in fossil fuels. You do believe in expanding coal mines, opening up the Galilee Basin, more coal seam gas and logging as many native forests as you can put the trucks and the bulldozers through. That is exactly what's going on, and it is a disgrace in Australia at this time in our history. And when people look back, they will see you as Neanderthals, and they are right to do so.